welcome to the Care Lab.
It's Care Lab Day. Welcome to my
Yay!
podcast. And welcome
Yay!
to Rusty. Rusty, thank you for joining us. I'm so excited that we get to have Rusty Fracassa here with us today. He's an attorney at law and the owner of Past Law Firm, and they do excellent work, specifically in elder law. And so, we come out here and we start talking about all kinds of random stuff, but we felt like if we're going to talk legal, we should probably actually have a lawyer here
Yeah,
so that
you
we
don't
don't get
want
y'all in trouble.
to. No one wants that advice from me, and I
Exactly.
don't want to give it.
So yeah. So Rusty, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank
Thanks
you.
for having me. Appreciate it.
So we like to start with a random question. And today I'm giving the random question. And so the question is, what's the most unusual thing about your life that impacts your work today?
Mm, well, when you live enough years, there's kind of a little few unusual things. But I'm actually in the middle of a PhD program in applied theology,
Oh,
so
wow.
that has to impact, when I'm meeting with people and working with people. Yeah.
How did you come to decide to do that? Because one, getting a PhD that's kind of a big deal. How did you
Well,
make that decision?
don't have it yet. I don't know. I get kind of, you hear these people, especially around the clients I work with, talk to their kids or to them, and they have these hobbies, and they flip houses or they go sit in a deer stand all day, and they just have these interests, and I have no interests. I have a lot of kids and grandkids, but as far as just hobbies and what I will do someday if I'm not working so much, and I have two master's degrees and a JD, and so with Juris Doctorate, and so I thought, wow, I really kind of just enjoy learning and studying and reading, and so I thought, PhD would be cool, and maybe someday if I want to write or speak or maybe be a visiting professor, a JD PhD is respectable. So I thought, yeah, I enjoy it. Let's do it.
So one doctor just wasn't enough. Is that basically what you're telling us?
I've heard that. Yeah.
I think that's so interesting, though. Like, you're talking about how you kind of look around at the other folks around you or people in your life, and they they have like things that they do for pleasure or fun, and you're like, huh, I don't really know what that would be for me. And I say that because I can totally relate to what you're saying. Like, if I didn't have the 100,000 things on my plate that I have to do every day for like work and my family and all this other stuff, like, what I don't know what I would do. Brandy,
Yeah.
do you know what you would do?
Sorry, y'all. I'm not on y'all team. I know exactly what
Probably.
I would do. I have a ton of hobbies and things that have been pushed to the side because of all of the other 100,000 things.
Hmm.
So if I answer my own question, I think uh, my interest in visual art, I think impacts my work now because it's a creative outlet that I don't get to use very often, but I use that same creative muscle to come up with solutions for my patients, if that makes sense. And so, I flex that muscle early on in like paint and supplies and canvas and all the things. If you come to my house, you'll see art all over the walls that's random and created by me, but that same kind of thought process goes into how I do my work now, I think.
See, I knew Brandy's the overachiever.
I mean, I don't know about overachieving, but the
I
problem with
do.
that is I just have too many things that I like to do. So then there's too much distraction. I'm too easily distracted.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Okay, I do have a good story about like something unusual that happened to me. This is a long time ago now. This is like almost, probably like 15 or 16 years ago. Um, but it does, like, it's not related at all to what I do now, but it has informed, I think, a lot of the way that I try to live my life in terms of my work, but also other relationships, and it has informed the way that I teach my kids about moving through the world. So, okay, so a long time ago, when my husband was in the Navy, um, we had to change duty stations. And when we did that, I lost my job, right? Because I had to leave from where we were, and we picked up and we moved across the country, went to a different duty station. So for a while I was on unemployment because I'd lost my job. And so I'm like trying to find new jobs, and you have to when you're on unemployment, you have to make good faith effort to actually go find a job. So I was doing that. But where we'd been stationed, there really just wasn't a lot. And there wasn't a lot that was related to my background or skill set. Like I have an undergrad, this is before I was an OT. So I had an undergraduate
Okay.
degree in psychology. And I had spent my time before that working with seriously emotionally disturbed children, and uh, doing research for like a big big time like PhD at a university where we had been stationed before. So there wasn't, I mean, I'm sure there's probably emotionally disturbed children everywhere, but we won't go down that depressing rabbit hole. Um, but there weren't like job opportunities just all over the place for me. So, so, but there were positions for parole officers.
You were a PO.
No, that's what this story. But I applied. So I'm just applying for whatever is available because I have to apply for work. So lo and behold, I get called to an interview to be a PO. And um and I'm like, "Oh my gosh." And it was like 50 miles away actually from where we were living. But the point of the story is I go into this job interview to be a parole officer of all things. Um and it's like this big group interview, and the fact is I do not want this job. I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Um so I just went in there and I had the most honest interview of my life to that point. Like they would ask me a question, they'd be like, "Would you be comfortable with this?" And I was just like, "No."
No. Because you just got to tell them that you applied. I applied. They didn't accept me.
Like I'm always my policy is that honesty is always the best policy in any situation. Like otherwise you just dig yourself down deep into a hole. So like I play by the rules. I try to be honest about things. Um but yeah, so anyway, but I walked out of the interview. I do have a point, and it was like such a freeing experience to just be totally honest about what I wanted and what I didn't want,
Mm-hmm.
and for them to also just be like, "Nope, this isn't a fit." Although I still did have to write an essay portion of my interview after I left. That was weird. I've never had to do that before or since. um but so the point is that what I learned from that experience is that it was just so much better to be totally honest about what actually would work for me and what wouldn't work for me, so that everyone ended up happy in the situation. Because if I had lied, if I had said, "Oh yeah, I can absolutely do this," just to like get this job, I would have been miserable. Probably they wouldn't have been happy with me because I wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
done the best job, right?
Yeah.
And it was just better that way. So like that was a really important lesson that I learned early on. Like, just be honest about what you can do, what you can't do, what your boundaries are, what your needs and your wants are, and and ask other people to be equally honest with you, because that's really the way to make like a successful business relationship, like friendship relate whatever it is. It's just that's what I learned. This is just about that. And like you will never feel tied up or like guilty or anything like that if you're just honest about what you need. At least that's been my experience.
I
Anyway, that
think
was
that
a
makes
long
a
story.
ton of sense. And I wonder, Rusty, too, if you feel like that leads to the lack of honesty leads more people into your office, or that they have longer conversations with you because they haven't been honest with each other about like what they want for end of life care or all those kinds of things.
Um, you know what's funny is because we deal with older people. One time I was at a seminar and there was this lady there and she had like a doctorate in nutrition and she was really into things. And she kept talking about longevity. You do this and you'll live so much longer. You do this and live so much longer. And so toward the end of the day, she even made statements like, if you eat properly, like you're supposed to, 114 is the estimated age. And I told her, I said, those are the people I usually work with, and not 114, but older people. And I said, once you get past 85, it's very seldom do I have people that are wanting to live longer. They're
Mm-hmm.
wanting to enjoy while they are living, but quantity is not a benefit to them. And that's one of the things that I guess it's because I was a pastor also here not too many years ago. And so, there's that whole counseling part of it. But I get a lot of people that are older that ask the question, why am I here? I don't really need to be here. And that is, because of my personality, there's a lot of those kind of conversations. um, I don't know. I find it exciting, and I feel like those people don't have anybody else to talk to because the kids don't ask
Mm-hmm.
that question. And being a parent, I'm confident I'm the oldest parent here because you guys are probably close to my kids' ages. Your parents aren't going to, they don't want to burden their kids with their irrelevancy or their fears of irrelevancy. So I think that, yeah, the honesty, I had never really thought about that. And I was going to say, oh, no, no, no. But yeah, I think that's true because we keep that facade of being,
Mm-hmm.
the provider, the protector, the one with the answers. And then we never really face that transition of life. Very seldom do I
Yep.
see that
Mm.
where people come in and have faced it. So, at first I thought, well, that's kind of a funny question. Uh, but it's like, no, actually, that's probably a pretty perceptive question. And it happens often. Yeah, I would have said no initially, but no, I think you're right. I have 3 appointments today, and I've met two of them before. And I think that's a very legitimate question for both of those clients. Yeah, they're not totally honest. I don't want to say they're dishonest, which would be the opposite maybe of honest, but they have just ignored what would be a legitimate conversation.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we're not honest with ourselves, or we don't really
Yeah.
know exactly what it is that we want, and so it's really difficult to have an open conversation if you don't know what you yourself wants, or one of the people in the conversation doesn't really know that. Which, I mean, I think we've all been there sometimes. Like, I'm not really
Yeah,
sure. I don't know.
that's what I thought of when you said other people being honest with you. And I thought, no, I don't know if I want that.
Well,
Sometimes it's kind of
honest
nice to be.
doesn't mean rude.
Oh man, that's funny.
Hey there, it's Emilia. Listen, I am so thrilled to have a great resource like Ask Sammy as part of the Care Lab team, and here's why. It's a game changer for aging in place because it makes it so simple. All you do is ask. Just type in your question or even tell Sammy what the problem is and get tailored solutions. Everything from innovative adaptive equipment to comprehensive resources. It's a great way to become more empowered, to live more independently, and to live with greater confidence. And my favorite thing about how Ask Sammy works is it's deeply rooted in dignity and practicality. So, whether you're a fellow therapist, a care partner, or someone who's seeking solutions for themselves, visit www.asksammy.com. We're going to link it in the show notes so you can find it there. Start making home more accessible today. Now, back to the show. So we do have we kind of almost segued into that was sort of a nice segue into real talk here already, but we did have a question for you kind of more specifically about estate planning that we wanted to get some insight for our listeners. Obviously, estate planning can be intimidating, it's complicated. That's why you need a lawyer, to a really knowledgeable lawyer to work with and do it. What are some of the mistakes or misconceptions that people either make or that they have about estate planning, before they come to you?
Well, that's kind of funny because you already mentioned one of them. about it being complicated
Mm.
because it very much is not complicated.
Oh,
I don't know why it has developed or evolved into something that people fear, um, and they have that attitude because everybody does.
mm,
The re- to answer one of your questions, one of the mistakes people have when they walk in, one of the first questions I always ask is, "Well, what would make you want to come see a lawyer?" And most people kind of avoid lawyers, and so I'd say 9 out of 10 times they say, "Well, I want a will because I don't want my kids to go through probate." Well, when I was a 30-year-old elder law attorney, it was a lot more difficult than it is now for me. Now that I'm older, people accept my statements much quicker. But what I mean by that is that assets that go through probate are assets that don't avoid probate. And if you don't have a will, the law in every state already has given you a way for your assets to pass to people. The only reason you need a will is that if you want to change what the law says. So most people believe a will avoids probate, and that's very much the opposite. Yeah, when I said that when I was a young person, it's kind of funny how it was always kind of I had to convince them, and now people are like, "Oh, really?" The reason why, though, so that's number one misconception. The second misconception about being difficult, and I just spoke for a hospice the other day, um, training their people, that it's kind of funny that everything's really in twos or threes. And what I mean by that, if you're, I talk about primarily three things in every appointment: powers of attorney, which I think are very important.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about death because it's the only guarantee. And then I
Mm-hmm.
talk about asset protection. Three things. On power of attorney, you either do power of attorneys in advance before incapacity, or there's only one other option, and that's a guardianship through the probate court should you become incapacitated. On death, you have a choice. Your assets are either going to go through probate or they're not. If you're going to avoid probate, you've got two options. You either do a living trust or you put beneficiaries on them. Joint titling is an option to avoid probate also, but I would recommend that only among, say, long-time married people. You never really want to put, a lot of people want to put a kid on a bank account and stuff, and you don't have to do that. That's what power of attorneys are for. But the reason why nobody will suggest joint ownership is because you're immediately exposing your assets to another person's problems, and you don't have to. So, see, everything's pretty straightforward. To do a full estate plan, you talk about incapacity, death, and asset protection. If you talk about incapacity, you either do power of attorneys or you don't, and you know what you're facing. When you die, if you want to avoid probate, you do beneficiaries or you do a trust. And that's it.
So maybe it's not that it's complicated, it's that it's unfamiliar to people.
mm.
Because you're saying
Those
basically that there's
are-
only like there's only a couple bifurcations, only a couple pathways, right? But all of those pathways you said, I understand them because we've talked before and we've done this stuff. But the first time I heard it, it did feel overwhelming because I didn't know any of those words you just said.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that.
But
Yeah,
yeah, it's not complicated. It's just that it might be unfamiliar because we haven't experienced it or done it yet. And so I think
I
that's
like
a
that. I
proof
think I'm
point.
going to start using that phrase, unfamiliar, um, because I think that that's far more accurate. Yeah, because it's not complicated. So that's why I'm confused because I'm using the wrong word. If I use the word unfamiliar, it'd be like, oh, yeah, it's kind of like if you started talking to me about occupational therapy. I would
hmm
be, we
Hmm.
just a year ago had our first medical incident. I've been married 40 years, and we had the first time we had to go to a hospital or had any incident. So when people start talking, it's not that it's complicated, it's just I never had to think about this before. Yeah,
Exactly.
I like that. Thank you.
Exactly.
Are there things that people assume are or are not going to happen based on their estate plan that are that maybe isn't necessarily true. So like an example, and of course it could depend entirely on how the estate plan is written, I'm sure, but so for example, if people have a power of attorney over someone's finances, that's not the same as having a power of attorney over someone's like healthcare wishes, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, I we like to do two separate ones. There are some attorneys, I don't see many of them, but enough to where they combine them. But oftentimes people have a perfect healthcare power of attorney. My wife is for my mother-in-law because we live right here, and my sister-in-law is the financial power of attorney, which is great because she's a CPA and she lives in Colorado. So it would be difficult if we had one power of attorney. And also, the
Hmm.
bank doesn't care about things like, nutrition, hydration. But likewise, the hospital doesn't care about things like, your right to access qualified assets. So, two separate ones. Yeah. Did that
I had a
answer your question?
question.
Sorry.
It did answer my question. I think that it's again, it's that unfamiliarity that folks have with saying, okay, well, I've got a power of attorney, that should cover everything, right? But it's about having the right power of attorney for the particular powers that you need to have in different situations.
Well,
That's what
that's
I'm hearing
very
and understanding.
well. That's very perceptive of you. Now, the healthcare power of attorney, I think that most healthcare workers, they don't get into that field without, a compassionate heart, and they just know that they have to have one. And there's not a lot of scrutiny. Um, there were the Terry Schiavo and Nancy Cruzan and some other cases, but
Hmm.
those are very much the minority. Most times people are just looking for something out there. The other power of attorney, the one that deals with financial matters, which is typically legally referred to as a general power of attorney, that's different. That one is very heavily scrutinized. And you touched on something. I can't remember what you called it, but I recognized what you were saying because my phrase is I say a good power of attorney because a lot of people think, oh, I have a power of attorney, I don't need one. Well, there's three quick qualities I look for an initial evaluation. And I always like to tell people what I'm looking for because I don't ever want people to think, well, he's just saying I don't have a good one so that he can, charge me money to have one. But these are really honestly, and like right here, that's not a factor here. But I want people to be able to determine on their own what is a good power of attorney, from somebody that's got over 30 years experience of just dealing with them. The first thing I always look at is size. And the reason I look at size is because most people that you're going to present that power of attorney to, they don't know really anything about the law and they don't know really what they're looking for. They're just kind of looking for what they think they've heard somebody told them. So, like the lady at the desk at the bank, maybe she's had some training from someone a few years ago. So she's looking for particular language, or the person at the insurance company or the person at the utility company. Well, the difficulty is that nobody is required to accept a power of attorney. So if those words that they're looking for aren't there, they can just very easily reject it.
Mm.
So the likelihood of it, if you have a 3-page power of attorney, general power of attorney, then the likelihood of the words not being there that people are looking for is much greater than if you have, say, a 10 to 20-page power of attorney. I've seen them where they go over that, but to me, that's also counterproductive because even I don't want to read those. So, number one, I look at size. Number two, I look to make sure it's immediately effective. Um, because it used to be back when I started practicing, you seldom saw those power of attorneys that were immediately effective. But one of the problems we always run into is that if Sammy's my power, or Brandy, sorry, I always want to say ask Sammy. If Brandy wants to,
Everybody does it. It's okay.
I did that good. If Brandy's my power of attorney, and I've had an accident, a stroke, something's happened, well, she needs to access my bank account. She needs to deal with my insurance company. You know, life is now, she had a full life before, and now she's taken over my life. She needs to get moving. Well, the problem
Mm-hmm.
is she needs to now contact my doctors and convince them to do some kind of letter. Well, contacting the doctors and getting a response for them takes time. To get them to cooperate may or may not occur. So
Mm-hmm.
now, how long is that going to be before you get what you need to activate the power of attorney? Then you have to send those letters, one or two letters, you have to attach them to the power of attorney. So now the utility company, the banks, the insurance companies, they all have very private information of mine. And honestly, Brandy, if I'm listing you as my power of attorney, I ought to trust you enough now that I can list you, that you're not going to go out and do something wrong, prematurely. So number
Yep.
one is size. Number two is immediately effective. And then number three, even though the power of attorney, everybody will say, oh, Brandy can do any and everything for me. Look, the power of attorney says Brandy can do anything I can do. Well, that's true, except for every state that I know of actually has a law that says, hey, that's true, except for these things. And in Missouri, there's 12 things, and I didn't count them for Kansas, but in Missouri, there's 12 things that the statute says you cannot do unless I specifically say you can do them. And for the third step, asset protection, we need some of those things. Now, I don't really know that I care so much about giving Brandy the authority to um, authorize an autopsy. That's one of the 12. But to change beneficiary designations, to make gifts, to deal with
For the
trusts.
record, I would let Brandy authorize my autopsy.
Oh,
I appreciate the level of trust.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
yeah. I'm usually more concerned about when a client's alive than when they're dead. But in any case, so when I always say that whenever I talk in twos or threes, and the three things there are when I'm going to glance at a power of attorney and just say, what's the likelihood that this is going to be something that I would not want to redo? I'll look at, is it 8 to 20 pages? Is it immediately effective? And does it contain the necessary language in there that we can later do some asset protection if we need to?
No,
The problem is you ask a lawyer and former pastor questions. And so the difficulty is not getting enough information. How do you stop them from talking? So just give me the
well,
hook.
I'm no, honestly, this is all really, really good. And the way you're presenting it is actually very easy to understand. I think I like the idea of talking about things in twos and threes because people have a tendency, the way our brains and our memories work, we remember things in clumps of twos and threes pretty well. So it's easy to say, oh, okay, so if I'm looking at this, maybe these are the three things that I'm looking for. If I'm speaking with my own attorney, these are the three things that I want to make sure that my attorney is bringing up,
Mm-hmm.
during the conversation. So I think that's a really helpful and manageable way to think about, these unfamiliar kind of issues for folks. I do have a question though about um finding, I think that the other part of having a power attorney or like in your advanced directive, you've got to say who might be making decisions. I think the thing that's really hard for families is choosing who that person is going to be. Sometimes that can be a really fraught kind of emotional decision and situation because you might know who you want to choose, but you might have fear based on the family dynamics of how that's going to, go or work out, or how everyone in the family might react to your choice. Do you help kind of like talk your clients through that situation or give them any advice, not on who necessarily they should choose, but how they should decide on what person they want?
Care Lab listener, I have a question for you. If someone you love was going to hire a caregiver, what qualities would you want that caregiver to have? You probably want them to be reliable, trustworthy, kind maybe, just a generally dependable good person, right? Second question, would you also want them to be trained? I'm going to guess the answer is an emphatic yes. Okay, third and final question for you. Do you think it matters who provides that training? Like, is it cool if it's just anybody? Or would you want that person providing the training to be a qualified expert? Assuming you do, in fact, love this person that needs a caregiver, you probably want the expert, right? Well, that's what Higher Standards Caregiver Training does. Higher Standards Caregiver Training provides 100% occupational therapist-led training for caregivers. Caregivers get taught everything from gold standard foundational skills for transfers and activities of daily living, all the way up to how to deal with specific diseases, injuries, and illnesses. And most importantly, they are taught these things in a practical way that enhances the participation of the person being cared for. And it protects the safety of everybody involved. Why? Because everybody deserves a higher standard. Find a course for individuals or learn about training for care organizations at higherstandardscaregivertraining.com.
You locked up, but I think you're asking me if to counsel them on choosing those who, are you talking about end of life decisions or healthcare decisions?
Either.
Ooh. Yeah. Why did you separate those actually?
Yeah.
Well, they probably shouldn't be separated. Here's the issue in dealing with seniors. Usually, what I find is the positions in a family, everybody has accepted their positions. I accept that my sister will be the caretaker. My sister has accepted that I will be the financial power of attorney and the executor and trustee for my father. Those are pretty well, by the time you've lived 50 to 60 years, they've pretty well set themselves in order. In fact, I'm working with a family right now. There's 9 children, and there's mom and dad. They live apart in different cities for legitimate reasons, but everybody plays their part, and there's really no arguing about it. Um, I think what happened in my own case, I remember when the kids were young and we had people, we were needing to list people that were outside the immediate family. Um, so we were thinking about like friends and family. And the concern there is that's very personal, but it's also putting quite a burden. Like when I was using Brandy as my example, Brandy's got a full life. And now suddenly for me to ask her to take over my life, um, that's a huge burden. You got to have a real special friend for that. Then your kids get to a particular age if you're dealing with kids, and the problem is with that is maybe you think they're too young, but if they're over, well, if they're teenagers or above, they think they have enough competency in life to run things. So it's usually not too much of a dilemma, to be honest. I think probably where I find the dilemma, and you guys are getting me to think about things I don't think about too often, but I find the dilemma is when you have a number of very solid kids in a very solid family. Unfortunately, that's not the common client. But when you have people, I had somebody yesterday and they had 2 daughters, and they absolutely could not decide between them. So in any case, because both of them are just stellar, and their husbands were stellar, and so, but that's not the most common. I will tell you that on the end of life decisions, on the living will or advance directive, um, usually, of course, you're going to put the spouse if there is a spouse, or there's a lot of times the majority of children is a very common factor. Usually, what happens is what I recommend that the person list, and they usually do it on their own, but it is the last person that would pull the plug, so to speak. So, for example, my wife is the first one listed because I know that Brandy's talking to my wife saying, "Hey, Renee, he's gone. He's not coming back. Um, it's okay to let him go. The hospital is, other people. She's going to be the last person. So that last person is probably the perfect person for nominating. But what I've come to discover is that those advance directives aren't really for me. They're for my wife, they're for Brandy, because I act as a power of attorney and trustee for a number of people. And so there's been people that I've had to remove life support from. And I remember Paul, it was about probably 25, 26 years ago, was the first person I did that for. If I'm acting as your power of attorney, that's a that's a pretty good indication of how you've lived your life, because you
Mm-hmm.
have no friends or family. So this attorney is stepping in to do it for you. And so there I was with Paul, and nobody's looking over my shoulder, absolutely no friends, no family at all. But when the hospice worker is talking to me about removing life support, that's on a human being. And that was a big deal. And
Mm-hmm.
I realized at that point, oh, when he wrote that advance directive, that was not for him. That was for me. That kind of gave me comfort to do what I thought was the right thing to do. And he thought I was the kind of person that he would trust my judgment. But that's what really took me over the edge in enabling me to make the right decision, or a good decision, was the peace of mind knowing that that's what he wanted when he got into this condition.
I think that's such an important point because like that's who's dealing with it, right? It's the person who's sick or having a hard time. They're not dealing with it. That's why you have to deal with it, right? If we're dealing with the power of attorney, and if this is somebody you like or love, and you want the best for them, and it's so much easier if they've already told you what that is, and that way, and there's also like less fighting involved with everybody else. And I've been able to see this play out in other people's lives, and watch how it impacts family dynamics and things. And if it's not clearly written out, then there's lots of room for uh, opinions, if that makes sense. And when you clearly identify it, then all we have to do is say, look, this is what mom wanted. This is what auntie wanted. She wrote it down here. And then that's the end of it. It silences that. We might not like it, but that's not for us to choose because this is her life or his life. And then that can just squash that instead of it billowing up into like a big problem.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's like a great kindness for the
Yeah.
people that you love that you're leaving behind when you pass away, to make sure that you have that clearly communicated, and frankly that the rest of your affairs are in order. I think that's something that my dad taught me, relatively early in life, after my grandfather passed away, and my grandfather had gotten everything in order, and my dad knew exactly what to do. So after my grandfather passed away, and it made it so easy for him, and he always has like really clearly communicated that to me and my brothers and sister, that like this is something that you do for your family, so that
Mm-hmm.
when they are already dealing with the grief of having lost you, there's not more complicated things that
Yeah.
they have to talk about. I also think, though, like kind of going back to the idea of an advanced directive, I think it's really important to have discussions about things like quality of life and what quality of life means to you, because there are things that an advanced directive cannot capture. You know, life and end of life, like that can actually be really messy sometimes, and it's not always clear cut on a page, right? So having a discussion with family about like quality of life and those wishes along with the advanced directive, I think is something that's important to do. Do you agree with that, Rusty, or do you think that like takes people down like a labyrinth of pathways that just gets overcomplicated?
You cut out on part of that. Could you give me a quick?
Yeah, yeah. So I was basically just saying that that, in my own experience, things that are, you can't lay out every possible scenario on an advance directive. It's just not possible because there are so many ways that things might go down kind of medically. So, I always think that it's important to have conversations about quality of life and what kind of quality of life someone wants to have as well. And I was asking, does that do you also advocate for those kind of conversations, or do you think that overcomplicates it for people?
Um, Usually what happens is the person or people that you're listing to be in this position are the ones that know you best, or you trust their judgment the best. They've spent the most time with you. These questions or topics or somewhat like these have come up in life. And so I think they just kind of naturally know. And even if I might differ, if I'm laying there on the bed and I might differ a little bit from what, say, my wife is deciding, my trust in her and my faith in her would, if I was competent, which of course I wouldn't be probably at that time, but that I would trust in her. I don't, what I typically will say to people is don't pay as much attention to what I have written in the power of attorney or living will as you do the person you're nominating. Because no matter how great a power of attorney I write, if you have the wrong person, they're going to do the wrong thing. If I
Mm.
write a very poor power of attorney, but yet you've nominated the right people, they will end up doing the right thing. My job is to make that right person's job easier. So, for
Mm.
example, on the financial power of attorney, I want to make sure that they're not going to have to go to the bank 3 times to get it accepted, and they're not going to have to argue with the insurance company. I want to make sure that if they go to the hospital, that some nurse is not uncomfortable with the way this document looks. I just want my daughter, for example, if she's the one that's acting, I want her to be able to make a decision and concentrate on the situation and not concentrate on dealing with some bureaucracy, at a bank or with a doctor. So, no, I usually pay far more attention to the person you're nominating than I do what the documents specifically say.
Hmm.
You're quiet. Did that throw you?
No, I think Brandy and I just didn't want to step on each other there.
Agree.
No, I think that's a great takeaway, and probably a good way place to kind of wrap up the conversation here.
Yeah.
Um, Rusty, is there any last parting words that you would want, any last parting words of wisdom that you would want to deliver to listeners of Care Lab?
Actually, I always end any presentations or even when I'm talking to people with a story that whenever, like sometimes I'll be somewhere out and people will say, "Hey, I need to come and see you. What do I need to bring with me?" And I'll say, "You don't need to bring anything initially. All I need is the answer to 2 questions." So these 2 questions would be good for a listener if they're going to go speak with legal counsel. And that is, you need to know who's in charge when you can't be and who gets what. Who's in charge includes any successors. Because if my wife and I list each other first and we're in an accident, well, if she's incapacitated, the moment I start acting on her behalf, I have lost my first choice because she can't do it for me.
Hmm.
So it's good to have a couple after that. So I always talk to people about thinking prior to our conversation who is in charge when you can't be and who is to get what. And then the second thing I always talk to people about is choosing the attorney that they work with. And there's kind of 2 things, 2 criteria that I pay attention to. Number one, I guess because I've gotten older, it's an important one, is experience. That's the one nice thing about having worked really with just seniors is I've not just done the planning, I've been on the other side for an enormous number of clients. They've gone into the nursing home, they've become incapacitated, they've died, and we've seen their plans go full circle. So it's a lot of that. Why do you put, I get the questions, well, why do you put that in the document? Or why are you asking me that question? Well, it's because I've been on the other side enough to know
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be important. So
Mm-hmm.
experienced attorney is number one. Well, I wouldn't say it's number one, but it's important. And the second one is somebody that you trust and is like-minded. Now, usually because I'm dealing with seniors, um, they usually have developed a great sense of discernment. You can't baloney older people too much, and kind of like, a 3-year-old, they know the kind of person you are. Well, guess what? An 80-year-old can tell pretty quickly also what kind of person you are. And so
Yeah.
I would say that, if you're comfortable with a person, um, if you're being honest, Amelia, like you talked about, if somebody's honest and they're comfortable with the attorney, and with that attorney clearly has experience in the area, then I'm sure that's going to be a very good choice. So that's it. Just who's in charge and who gets what, and look for somebody who is experienced and that you're comfortable with.
Simple nuggets to take with us. I appreciate you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all your wisdom.
Well, thank
Yes,
you for the
thank you so much,
opportunity.
Rusty.
Looking forward to your other podcasts.
Listen, y'all, if you enjoyed this episode of the Care Lab podcast, please make sure that you are subscribing. Make sure that you're sharing it with others who might also benefit from listening to the podcast or who might enjoy it, and make sure that you are liking it as well. And that will all help to make it so that next time we release an episode, you will get notified right away so you can check it out. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Brandy. Thanks, Rusty. Thanks, listeners. And we'll see you next time on the Care Lab podcast.
Next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.